All right. Hello, everybody. This is Eric Gearthaler at Sit Down by the Fire. I am here with my two special guests. One of them is a returning guest, and one of them is a new guest. So, ladies first.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lynne Lugosi Sparks, and I'm happy to be here with author Robert Cremer, and speaking with Eric.
But yeah, uh, but yeah, um, but yeah. Thank you for sharing that, and I also want to thank you for taking time out of your day to be here.
Of course.
But yeah, Bob, your turn now.
Yeah, I'm Bob Cremer, and I authored the book Lugosi, The Man Behind the Cape. And Lynn and I have come up with a greatly expanded version of it called Bela Lugosi, The Man Behind the Cape. And Eric, I thank you very much for inviting us to be on your podcast. That's really nice.
Oh yeah, cer- certainly so. And I've been a big Bela Lugosi fan my entire life, and ultimately, and ultimately, whichever that I can do, to help to keep his memory alive. So,
We appreciate that.
oh
Yes.
yeah, certainly. So, my first question, so what exactly started this whole journey about this book?
Well, Bob, you should take that back. Goes to what, 1972?
Yep. Yeah. I moved to Los Angeles from Taiwan and began working at the Hollywood Reporter. And that was not enough money to pay all the bills. So I started dabbling in Hollywood history and learned by accident that Lynn's father, Bela Lugosi Jr., lived in Los Angeles. And I, like you, was a lifelong Bela fanatic actually,
Yeah.
fanatic. And I started doing research at the Margaret Herrick Library, and a lot of information was alluded to in articles that I read, and some of it, of course, very um, exaggerated regarding his drug addiction. And it just interested me to the point where I contacted Bela Lugosi Jr. and met with him and suggested doing a biography. And he then introduced me to his mother, Lillian, who was Bela's wife of 20 years. And we had a long discussion about the scope and the focus of the book. And I said to her, I said, uh, there seems to be a lot of a lot of misinformation cursing through the press. And I said, how do you feel about that? And she said, I feel the same way. And I said, well, I said, if you would be interested in really portraying the true story behind all of this, I would love to work with you on the book. And if you're not in agreement with that, then I just won't write the book because I want to learn who this man really was, what his life was like, what his principles were, what motivated him to act in the way he did, and that it has to be authentic and real, not
Mhm.
covered up or looking at his life through rose tinted glasses. I really want to do the real story. And she said, that's exactly what I want to do. And that was the origins of the book. And in the process, I not only spent, I can't even begin to calculate how many hours and weeks and months I spent with her, but she also arranged for me to meet Bela's closest friends and some of his family members, many of whom knew him already in Hungary. So this spanned the time from his original uh, career development in Europe to the United States. And a lot of that information was, of course, personal information that nobody else could get. And that's what we have to offer in this book is the insights, the information, and the interpretation of facts that only the people who knew him intimately could provide. And I think that is what makes this book incredibly unusual as a biography of a film star is that we are going for a different focal point than most of them. We're not just talking about films. Gary Rhodes, Bill Kaffenberger, Frank Dello have all done magnificent analyses of his film career. And we use the films, of course, as reference points in his life. But our focus really is on who was the man? What were his values? Why did he lead such an exceptional life and, in many cases, a tragic life? Because he refused to compromise his principles. Um, and Lynne has done an absolutely incredible job of finding, sometimes very aggravating because we took ages to really identify some of the photos, but finding documents and poetry and artwork that really exemplify all of the elements in the text related to his life so that it's almost like one of those early 1920s flip books where you flip the pages and you see the
Mhm.
pictures illustrating the life as you read it.
Yeah.
And Lynne, you might want to comment more on that.
Well, yeah,
Okay.
I think that, that's the origin story. And then, fast forward almost 50 years, and I'm working with my dad to maintain my grandfather's legacy. And I keep seeing references to Bob's book. And but you can't, and people were trying to find copies of the original book at pretty high prices because it wasn't easily available in stores or online, other than used copies for the most part that people had. And at that time, I realized there was so much more information, and like Bob referenced, some of the other researchers had been able to update the filmography and the stageography, and I just wanted Bob's book and our family's legacy to be available to a new generation of fans and to the wider public. As a history book in libraries and film archives. And so we, embarked on this project of trying to reissue the book in its expanded, you know, definitive form, which I think it is now. Although, things still pop up from time to time, and I
Mhm.
have to just accept that there are going to be things that might not be included in that book, but that's okay because for the most part, we fully document both, in text and in photographs, my grandfather's life.
Mhm. Yeah, and I actually had no idea that Bela even did poetry, and so it really goes to show that you really do learn something new every day, and I definitely will be very excited to like to actually read his poetry in the book itself, and of course once I read it in the book, I definitely won't be able to help it, but it's just once I read it, it's just inside of my head. I definitely am going to hear like his voice,
Yeah.
saying it. So yeah.
Well, it was kind of an adventure working with the Film Archive in Budapest, who introduced us to a translator who was able to translate that poetry, because like Bob can explain, um, some of the words and the terms, they had to be defined, right, Bob? It's like the meaning wasn't the same maybe now, or how it was written, that Bela was probably trying to get across in the poetry.
I Yeah, and so yeah, and so I guess from your guys' research, um, so uh, so was that something that came later on in his life, or was it something that he did throughout his life, or what? What the whole poetry thing?
Well, the poems that are written in Hungary, he wrote when he was in Hungary, he did write letters to my grandmother from time to time that I consider poetic in nature, but we don't have a lot of documentation of like a lot of poems, that would indicate that he did it all the time. But I think he was a very creative and very intelligent person. So
Oh,
I think he expressed himself in various ways, poetry being one of them.
yeah, and I just feel like it's just really incredible, like just knowing that that all of that survived all of that time. So
Yep.
The poems that Lynn found were written in 1902, which was when he was just beginning his career on the Transylvanian theater circuit. And but later, when Bela was faced with divorce, he wrote to Lillian, and the letters that he wrote to Lillian were in effect another form of poetry. So we don't have anything in between that would indicate that he wrote poetry regularly, whether for himself or for publication.
right.
But we know that he had a very, very distinct poetic instinct, and that he was quite gifted.
Yeah, and yeah, and I mean, I can definitely imagine. So, like that, he was very, very gifted at that. And yeah, and it's just really exciting. Would like to know that once this book comes out, that like that all the readers, I can get a taste of what his gift was at that.
Yeah, and I'd like to just add that you mentioned that it was amazing that these things still exist and that we found them. I have to give just a huge amount of credit to my grandfather himself, because I think he was kind of like me in a way, a saver. He liked to document his career, but my grandmother Lillian also was just did a meticulous job of preserving the photos and the clippings and their life, personal family photographs for years and years and years. And so if it weren't for her, and then for her intuition to kind of save some of these things at the end of his life from, other people borrowing them or taking them, we do have a lot of these things. The poems in particular actually did end up with a collector, but people are so generous and want to see Bela's legacy, published and out to the wider audience, that people have shared these things with us that, some people might keep to themselves as being very special because they came across it, and just want to keep it to themselves. But they have shared these things that were originally in with my grandfather that, we unfortunately don't have in our personal collection, but they shared them with us for the book, and I really appreciate that.
Oh yeah, certainly so. And I mean, it's definitely very, very nice of them to do that. And I mean, of course, I don't want to speak for every single collector out there, but there are some like who are willing to share it, and there are some like who aren't. And yeah, I'm definitely thankful that they fell under the category of like of being generous about it.
Yes.
Definitely. Yeah, we
you
got a lot of.
obviously you obviously know the collector world.
Oh yeah, certainly so. Yeah, and yeah, and I mean, it's rather incredible, like by what some of these people have, and yeah, like I know that there's I I think it's like a museum, or it's some sort of facility. I'm pretty sure it's down in Los Angeles, like where they actually have the cape that Bela wore, not in the 31 movie, but they have the one that he wore in Abaddon Stelomete Frankenstein, and yeah, and then
No,
in
that
the
actually that's the Academy Museum, which is a part
okay,
of the Academy of Motion Pictures. So that is the 1931 cape, and that's the cape that was with our family from my dad's entire life until a few years ago when he decided to share it with the world and made an arrangement for the Academy Museum to include the cape in their collection.
Awesome. Yeah. And I can only just imagine, well, I guess, just how incredible and just how enticing it would be, like to see that in person.
We have family stories that my mom had told me that, that was always just preserved nicely in like a cedar closet, they hung over a hanger. My grandfather and grandmother took care of that cape. Of course, it was such a piece of my grandfather's life that they took care of it very well. And so this cape is, the fabric and everything stayed in beautiful condition. But one time, my younger brother, it was in kindergarten and it was show and tell day. And so they decided to take the cape for show and tell. And at lunchtime, the teacher called my mom and said, "Is this the cape that Bela actually wore?" And she said, "Yes." She said, "Can you come please pick it up?" Like she didn't just want it to be in the kindergarten classroom handled by all these kids. So my mom had to go to the school and pick it up. And so from time to time, family members would wear it, just kind of to play or to look at it. But it's funny. It's such a piece of history. It's really like the hero item of horror films. And for us, it was we kept, we had it in the closet and got to look at it from time to time. And it was fun for the family to have.
Oh yeah, I can imagine, and I also can imagine that that for everybody like who put on the mask. Oh, wait, sorry, not mask, a cape. I do not know where that came from, but it's just as soon as people put on the cape, I can imagine that they probably instantly felt like that they were the Count himself.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I mentioned it to you when we spoke last time, but before the cape left our house, which was a very traumatic event for all of us, but in the end, we're happy that it will be preserved. I did a full pattern of every seam, documented the material, how everything was sewn, and we replicated it as a costume cape version. And it's a wonderful piece to have. And we do take it to conventions or events and let people just try it on, because you're exactly right. When they put that cape on, whether it's the weight or the scale, because it's quite large, people really just channel Bela, and it kind of connects them in a way, even though it's a costume.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and matter of fact, I have heard similar stories about a lot of the other actors, like who have played Dracula. A lot of them have said the exact same thing.
Mm. Yeah.
And I mean, granted, they may not have worn, the same cape on that Bela did, but a lot of them have said the exact same thing. So, yeah, and I can see why. It's hard to put it into words. There's just something about that cape, that it just puts you into that mindset.
Yeah. Well, he was the original.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, and so yeah, and so what would you say was the most challenging aspect of this new book?
Well, I mean, it grew from our initial conversation of reissuing the book and adding some more pictures and some more updated filmography and stageography. And Bob wanted very much to include the full interviews and more of the information that he was limited to in the page count of the original book. But I think for me, the challenge was finding and organizing the pictures and documenting them properly. So there's over 1,100 pictures in the book.
That's a lot.
Yeah. but from the writing end, Bob had his Bob, I think it'd be interesting, and Eric and his listeners might want to hear about the original book and trying to go behind the Iron Curtain and get some of that early documentation.
Yes, that was, we realized in doing the interviews with members of his family who also knew him in Hungary, Bela Lugosi in particular, and his closest, really closest best friends, Vili Sitya, for one, who was a major source of information about the book. They couldn't fill in all the gaps and the questions that I asked about his time in Hungary, starting out, working in the mines and Resitsipanya, and then working on steam locomotives in Sabatka. And so I was talking to Lillian about this, and I said, "Well, I'm going to have to go over and see what we can find out." This is 1973, at the height of the Cold War, and traveling behind the Iron Curtain. And she said, "Well, we never." She and Bela had planned to visit Hungary, um, following a film that he shot in Great Britain, but Universal insisted that they come back immediately for work on the Invisible Ray. And so they had to cancel that trip. And subsequently, they never made it back to Hungary. And she said, "Well, I would really like to go with you because I never made that trip to Hungary with Bela that we had planned." And so she accompanied me on the trip. And we spent immense amount of time in Hungary and then in Romania, in Lugos, the town where he grew up, was born and grew up. And it was amazing because the one thing that I didn't reckon with or think about became the major obstacle in doing research there, that during the Soviet occupation of those countries, we were not allowed to use photocopiers. We had to write down everything by hand that we wanted to take with us.
That was
And
on paper. Not, of course, nothing in any kind of a form
an
other than,
electronic,
yeah.
yeah, and cameras. As Americans, we could not bring cameras anywhere, so there wasn't even the option of taking pictures of pages. And so Lillian would go through all the Hungarian stuff and then push it over to me and say, "Bob, copy this part, copy this part. This is important, that's important." And so that really lengthened our research time far beyond the limits that we had planned. And the head of the Hungarian Film Institute had to constantly act as our ambassador to the Soviet regime to get us um, an extension of our time, because you had to file a very, very concise itinerary when you traveled in Hungary. And you had to note what routes you took to get to the city you were going to. You had to justify why you wanted to be there, and you had to talk about exactly how long you were going to be there and what your next stop was. And of course, none of that worked out because we figured we could photocopy things, and we had to do it by hand. And so it was an interesting adventure, but the Hungarians were marvelous. They supported us at every turn, and they were no fans of the Soviet occupation either. So we found a lot of support, and especially when the name Lugosi was mentioned. Lillian opened up doors everywhere for us. I mean, there was no one there that didn't recognize the name, and the older people actually remembered. There was one waiter at a restaurant who talked with us for about a half hour about a stage performance he saw Bela in, and remembered that very clearly. So it was a marvelous trip, and the thing is that we didn't weren't able to find all the information we wanted to, because at that time the conditions in Hungary and Romania were extremely austere because the Soviets were sucking out everything they could from those countries to support the Soviet Union. And that meant that the people were impoverished, the infrastructure was very, very weak, and the libraries and museums were understaffed and underfunded, so that they had no real grasp of their own collections. And many times we'd ask for something and they couldn't find it because they simply had not had the staff and the time to adequately catalog all the information there that they had. So it was a bit frustrating in some respects, although we did get quite a bit of information when we were there. But the digital sources that came after that, after the internet, certainly helped us to expand our search in other directions that brought about really interesting information. And we got a lot of it from uh, facilities in Hungary and a historian in Romania who did a lot of groundbreaking research on Bela's early life in Lugos. And so we've managed to fill a lot of the major gaps, the important gaps in his life. And that led, of course, to delays in publication because we wanted to fill out as much of that information as we could to provide a really comprehensive biography.
Yeah, wow. And I mean, just knowing that the photo copying thing didn't work, so you had to do it all by hand. Like, wow. I mean, that's a very time-consuming process.
Yeah, and we had to do the same thing in Romania. And we reversed the process because I knew enough Romanian that I could deal with that. And then Lillian would sit there writing everything down. And we had to get extra suitcases for all the paper that we brought back with us. It
Wow.
was amazing. I had 3 extra suitcases.
Oh my gosh. I don't think I knew
Yeah,
that.
yeah, that,
Yeah.
it was, yeah. But as I say, these are the things you don't plan for. We assumed we'd have photocopiers there and we could, and I based my time limits in certain cities based on that fact that we wouldn't have any delays of any kind. And then there were nothing but delays because of the political situation in the countries at that time. And our being Americans didn't make it any simpler.
And
And to this day, I don't even remember how I managed to convince the Hungarian government to let us into the country. I cannot remember exactly what I did, but it worked.
it was so traumatic. And Eric, something interesting to think about is Bob's original book has been used by all researchers and biographers of Bela Lugosi since that book was written as a research tool. So a lot of their books that include information on Bela originally came from the original Lugosi, the man behind the cape, and all of Bob's research and interviews. So I'm very happy that this book will come out and um, reaffirm to the world that Bob really was the original authentic biographer of Bela Lugosi. And all these other books are very nice, but Bob's is like Bela, is the original and will be the definitive.
That's
Well, thank
amazing. Yeah.
you.
Yeah. And honestly, I actually was not aware of that either. And, and it really just goes to show like the impact of the magnitude that book had. I can imagine that when they made the Ed Wood movie, like with Martin Landau, I wouldn't be surprised. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if they even used that book like as a way to try to portray Bela as accurately as possible, even though it wasn't entirely accurate because, Bela didn't ever swear as much as he did in the movie. And there were a few other inaccurate things too, but I can imagine that for a few things here and there, I can imagine that they might have used that book.
Bob, I think Eric will find it interesting about your communication with Tim Burton and that the
Yes,
making of.
we had discussions with Tim Burton, Bela Jr. and I, and when he began talking about some of his scenes from the movie that he envisioned at that point, he mentioned one that Bela would be trying out a coffin in a funerary store, and Ed Wood happened by and saw him in the coffin and came in, and that's how they met. And Bela and I mentioned to him, well, actually, he met Ed Wood through Alex Gordon, a friend of Ed Wood's who had worked with Bela before, and arranged a meeting over fish head stew at Bela and Lillian's apartment. And that Ed Wood had so much trouble concentrating on talking business because the fish heads were a part of the stew and they kept floating and turning around so that the eyes were always staring at Ed Wood and he couldn't concentrate. And Tim Burton just dismissed it. He wasn't even interested in it. And I felt it was a much, much more humorous way and the truth. It was the truth. And what did Tim Burton have against the truth? And of course, he made numerous other um, errors in the film because he didn't research his life all that carefully, which leads me to assume that he really didn't read the book because Lillian made it absolutely clear, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Bela's dependence on drugs happened after the divorce, and it was primarily Demerol. He took morphine very, very seldomly in the 1930s, and that was it. He never became a morphine addict. And in the movie, the doctor tells Ed Wood that he was completely loaded with morphine when he entered the hospital. And that was not true at all. And the fact that he swore at his fans was a cardinal sin on Tim Burton's part, and he should shame himself for that. Bela revered his fans. His fans were his idols, and he would never, ever behave in that way with his fans. And Tim Burton should have known that if he didn't know anything else. But, you know, that's Hollywood.
That's a real shame. And yeah, and so, yeah, and I mean, it shows that I was inaccurate, like for thinking that he might have read the book. And yeah, and I mean, that's error on my end. And yeah, I take accountability about that. But yeah, it's really is a shame.
Well,
And yeah.
Eric, it could be that, I mean, we sent him the book, but it was clear when we were talking to him that he hadn't read it because the first thing he described was this meeting between the first meeting between Ed Wood and Bela that never happened. And in the book, we did explain how they met.
Yeah.
So that's why I assume that he really didn't read the book, or if he did, he chose to ignore it.
Because Bob had extensive interviews with Ed Wood for the book. Much of that information is included in that. So uh, if they had wanted to know some of these stories that Ed Wood said directly to Bob, they could have had that information too.
You know, they could have basically used elements from my 4 days of interviewing Ed Wood for the movie if they'd been interested. But it didn't appear to me or to Bela Jr. for that matter, that Tim Burton was really interested in hearing about alternatives to his gags and treatment of Ed Wood in the film. So, you know, be that as it may, it's a shame that, as Bela Jr. said, Martin Landau did a really, really good job as
Mhm.
Bela, but you know, he was working with a script that wasn't, you know, entirely accurate. And the tragedy is nothing would it would not have been detracting to the film to use the truth. That's the tragedy of the film, is that it could have been
Yeah.
a much, much more accurate depiction of Bela as he was as a person,
At that time
without
in his life.
losing any of the humor, without losing any of the pathos, the tragedy, the sadness, but the humor and the joy as well. It could have been a fabulous biographical film and a very entertaining docudrama of sorts, but Tim Burton chose another path, and
Yeah.
we
And-
have what we have.
yeah. And
That's
it
really
is
great.
unfortunate because it really brought Bela back into the awareness of a new generation, and created an interest in him and looking back at his film. So for young people seeing that movie and thinking it is a biography, that he did the film was, so interesting, I guess, that people take it as a true biography. So it is tragic that the truth wasn't
Yeah.
told, but it did do the legacy a great service in keeping Bela's uh, name out in the public and introducing him to a new generation.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
it
that's
sounds like,
well said, Lynn.
yeah, definitely. So it sounds like it's a double-edged sword, like where I actually have met fans like who were, like who were young when the Ed Wood movie came out, and they said that it was because of the Ed Wood movie is how they found out who Bela was,
Right.
which is great. But
Yeah.
the double-edged sword, but
Yeah.
but it's just a shame that that they have to be misled by some of it. A very common one, which I can imagine that the book does mention about, is how a lot of people have assumed that Bela and Boris Karloff were like hated each other and they had that feud. And there's that scene in the Ed Wood movie where like where he's swearing about Karloff and is saying all these not so pleasant things about him. But from what I know, those two may not have been like the bestest of friends, but at the same time, but at the same time, they definitely did not hate each other at all.
Yeah, it's been nice that the families, Karloff, Cheney, Lugosi families have, stayed in touch over the years. And not only has Sarah Karloff, said things in interviews, but she said them to my dad, and she has said them to me that, kind of straightened out those stories that she just never, that was never her interpretation from her father. She didn't ever hear things said like that, or that he felt that Bela didn't like him.
Yeah, Lillian also made it absolutely clear that they lived in two different worlds. Karloff was a cricket fan, Bela was a soccer fan. Uh, Karloff grew up in um, a suburb of London and Bela in Transylvania. And they had very, very different lifestyles that basically only intersected on a uh, film studio set, but they still had respect for one another. And Lillian told me that they both had one very important thing in common that brought them together more often than not. They hated Hollywood parties, both of them. And so she said when Bela absolutely had to show up at these parties, Boris was also there. And the minute they saw each other, they they went to a corner and secluded themselves from the rest of the party and sat and chatted and joked and had a good evening uh, without having to mingle with the rest of this, the party goers who were there to do business, talk business, look for deals and whatnot. And they just hated that. And so when they found each other at a party, it was like salvation. And so Lillian said there's absolutely nothing at all to those rumors that they hated each other and that they were fierce competitors. They were competitors, but not in the sense that it interfered with their being very civil and cordial to one another when they were together. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that Sarah even mentioned to me, which makes sense, a lot of that probably just could have been a marketing idea, like from like Hollywood, like just to try to hype it up, that those two had a big, that those two like were big time rivals and all that, which I mean, from a marketing perspective, I can imagine that that could be one of the things as to where that came from. So,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
so
I mean,
yeah,
they did constantly look for mechanisms to keep people in the public eye, and the stories of other stars who were adversely affected by those rumor mills, as they used to call them in Hollywood. They actually damaged careers in many cases, and in this case, fortunately, it didn't hurt either of them in any way. Um, but as I say, the statements by Lillian and also by Sarah were absolutely unanimous that there was no animosity between them at all.
which and I mean, and it goes to show like just how much that it's says about both Boris and Bela. Like it really says a lot about them as people, like knowing that they were competitors and yet they were cordial about it because unfortunately. Uh, with everyone who would be cordial about it, there's also those who would not be cordial about it. And so, yeah, I am definitely really thankful to hear that Bela and Boris fell into the latter category about where they were cordial about it. And yeah, and I mean, it says like just how professional they were. It says, a lot about their integrity that they had. And yeah, yeah, I definitely really have to applaud them for
Well,
that.
I think that it probably, all of this goes back to, of course, the casting of Bela in Frankenstein, and then Boris eventually playing the monster. So that's where this all started, and that in and of itself is a very interesting story. I don't know if you have time to hear it today, but Bob can tell you that story of what actually happened with the casting of uh, Bela as originally as the monster and refusing the part, but how that came about.
Yeah, because from what I've heard, there are two sides of the story. Like there's one where like the director James Whale wanted someone else, and there's also the story about how Bela refused it simply because he would have to wear makeup. It was a non-speaking role, and so yeah, it definitely will be great that once when the book is out, you know, that it can shed a lot more light on that.
Yeah, well, originally, Robert Florey was set to direct, and he wrote the screenplay for Frankenstein. And he spoke with Carl Laemmle on numerous occasions about his plan to use Bela Lugosi as Dr. Frankenstein. And he justified that on the basis of his masterful, unique interpretation of Dracula. And he was convinced that if Bela assumed the role of Dr. Frankenstein, he would create another similar character that would become an icon of Hollywood history. He told me that in all of these conversations, Carl Laemmle was in full agreement with that. And at one point, all of a sudden, Robert Florey was told, um, we need to have a screen test of Bela as the monster. And the reason for this was, and Florey only became aware of this later, that Laemmle was talking personally with Whale about taking over the direction of the film. And Whale expressed his interest in having Bela as the monster because he was Dracula and Frankenstein is the monster. And Robert Florey went through and said to Bela, do the test. They won't like it. And then we'll talk again with Laemmle about my plan that you play the role of Dr. Frankenstein. Well, true to Carl Laemmle's total incompetence with production at Universal, he decided that he was going to put his new boy wonder on the block, James Whale, in charge of Frankenstein. And that led Whale to say, you're going to be the monster. He wasn't even consulted about it, and they started producing publicity materials with Bela as the monster.
Mm-hmm.
And Bela had told both his closest friend, Billy Sitya, and his wife, Lillian, this is a role that could be bigger than Dracula, Dr. Frankenstein. He felt he could do things with that role that would even surpass Frankenstein. And when he was then summarily informed, you're going to be the monster, take it or leave it, he left it. And for a very good reason, that he knew what was possible under Florey and what would only be possible under Whale. And he felt that that was not going to be an enhancement of his career, just grunting and groaning as a monster in makeup where you couldn't even see him anyway. And on that basis, he turned down the role of Frankenstein. But his friend Billy Sitya said it made perfect sense at that time. Lillian did not agree with Billy and said if he'd had, if he'd had his all of his marbles, he would have taken the role to maintain his uh, dominance in the horror film genre. And she was convinced that his turning the role down really set in motion the things that would ultimately uh, put him in a second class citizen role in horror films below Boris Karloff. But in point of fact, the mistakes that he made, and we talk about them at great length in the book, and Lillian makes her views quite clear about it. There were other factors and decisions he made in his career following Dracula that had a much, much more deleterious effect on the future of his career in film than turning down the Frankenstein monster. So people can read about that.
Awesome. Yeah. I definitely am really excited to read about that. And I already know that my listeners and every other fan is going to be excited to read about that. And so, yeah, I am. But yeah, that all definitely sounds very exciting.
Yeah, we scratched the surface. We just scratched the surface.
Awesome. Yeah. And so, with all that said, for you to get that information, did you actually have to contact Did you actually have to contact Universal?
Well, I contacted the directors. Those stories came directly from Robert Florey, and other information about the short running time of The Black Cat and the problems with production of that, I got directly from Edgar Ulmer. Universal does not talk about anything. Everything is no comment. Yeah. But Robert Florey made all of those statements, the entire discussion that I had with him concerning the turning down of the role of Frankenstein, the monster, by Bela, is in the book.
Okay.
So readers
Awesome.
will be able to find out exactly what happened there, and he goes into some detail about how the sequence of events caught both Robert Florey and Bela off guard because Carl Laemmle was basically going behind their backs and initiating discussions with James Whale about taking over the production, in spite of the fact that Robert Florey had expected to not only write the screenplay, but also to direct the film.
Huh. Wow. I had no idea that all of that took place. And yeah, and I mean, I definitely was aware that James Whale took over, but it just wasn't aware of all the nuances to it. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, those are the nuances that only the people involved in the issue, in the events themselves can provide. And Robert Florey was very forthcoming and very open about his aggravation and disappointment, and the fact that he felt that Bela would have indeed at least equaled, if not surpassed, the power of his characterization of Dracula as Dr. Frankenstein. And I believe he was right. We
mhm.
look at Roland Lee years later for the role of Igor that Bela created himself for Son of Frankenstein in 1939. And Roland Lee was just like Robert Florey. He said, Bela has a quality where he can take a role and turn it into something where he is not playing a character, he is the character. And he went against Universal, which wanted Bela's scenes to be shot in 5 days so they didn't have to pay him much money. And Roland Lee told Lillian, I'm going to keep him on the set for every day of production, right to the end of production, so that he makes as much money as Karloff does. And he did that. And during that time, he gave Bela full reign to develop the character of Igor.
Yeah.
And look what happened.
Yeah.
Igor became the star of the show. And if we think about this time span between Dracula in 31 and Igor in 39, imagine if other directors had had that faith in him and in his talent to develop unique characterizations, how many wonderful characters we would have had in horror films in between. But unfortunately, that didn't happen.
Yeah, wow. And it says a lot about him as a person, like just knowing that, just knowing that he wasn't going to compromise like on the talent and on the integrity like of Bela, knowing that he believed in him and yeah, and rightfully so. Bela deserved just as much pay like as Karloff did. And I definitely have to really applaud him for doing that. And yeah, and a lot of fans like I have gone on to say that yeah, Bela stole the entire show like as Igor, and I mean so much so where where often like in pop culture, that the Hunchback character often is referred to like as Igor.
Right.
When those who have seen the original 1931 movie know that his name was not Igor in the original movie. So
Yeah. 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 My dad remembers a conversation with his dad about, his dad telling him how much he enjoyed playing the character of Igor because he had, kind of creative license over the character, but also that he could bring this element of humor to a part that he wasn't often given the opportunity to do.
yeah, yeah, I especially love what he did with his voice because what I do know is that in some documentaries, that your father would talk about how he got typecast due to his accent. But it's just a shame that a lot of people couldn't see past that, because I would argue that his role as Igor shows, definitely does show that he can expand outside of his accent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that was where my grandfather's frustration, was that he was just almost like a caged bird as far as his craft, that he wanted to do so much more and felt that he could do so much more, and was never really given the opportunity to do that, like he was maybe on some of his stage roles in Hungary. And so, in being typecast and not given a wide variety of characters to play, he wasn't able to show what he could do.
Yeah,
Yeah, that
it's
really
amazing that in Hungary, when he was working at the in Debrecen in regional theater, and then later in Budapest at the Nemzeti Színház, the national theater, actors were expected to play 40 or 50 roles a year. Some major roles, some minor roles. There was a mixture, but the diversity was mandatory. And this is the environment that Bela grew up in professionally. And when he suddenly began to see his horizons being limited by what Hollywood was willing to offer him, he became incredibly frustrated and incredibly irate. And Billy Sitja mentioned just innumerable conversations he had with him where he said, I just cannot show them what I am capable of because they only see one character in me, Dracula. And and there are interesting, very interesting portions of the book that go into detail through interviews with people who knew him well at that time and were very, very involved with his professional career, who explain why that happened. And it always takes two to tango, as they say, and the two that tangoed in this case were Hollywood producers and Bela himself. There's a second side to the story that we illuminate in great detail in the book because it's important to understand how Bela was not always, but quite often, his own worst enemy. And that makes for interesting reading.
Oh yeah, certainly so. And yeah, and one of the things that I really applaud Bela for doing is that, knowing that around the time like when he was doing movies with Ed Wood, knowing that he was battling that morphine addiction, and then yeah, and then just knowing that, knowing that he got himself the help that he needed. And yeah, and I mean, it really, yeah, I really applaud him for that, because there are some people out there like who will deal with a addiction of any kind, and they won't get the help that they need. But just knowing that he did, and it really goes to show that there's always help out there. You just have to be willing to reach out.
Yeah, and at that time, of course, when he made the announcement, it was considered in Hollywood almost career suicide, professional suicide, to admit a dependence, whether it's on alcohol or drugs or whatever it might be. Uh, the word addiction did not please studios and could damage an actor's career permanently. And he took the step he needed to take and did it and got rid of his dependence on Demerol and on alcohol after 3 months in the hospital. And this is what has been incredibly maligned in the press because the clippings from every newspaper in Hollywood and across the nation, for that matter, at that time, took up this cudgel that he had been a drug addict for 20 years and 25 years, and he was addicted to morphine, which was never the case. And the 20 and 25-year scenarios simply don't pan out because Lillian was with him during those 25 years. And she explains in the book exactly what she did to prevent him from becoming dependent on drugs. And that he only developed a dependency on Demerol and methadone at times after the divorce in 1953. So if any of these papers wanted to tell the truth, they would have said he had become dependent on drugs following the divorce in 1953. And that's the true story. And there's a lot to that story, and none of it has been covered in the press, but we have covered it in great detail in the book, including the hospital records during the time he was in the hospital being rehabilitated, and really lengthy discussions that I had with the physician who handled his problems at the hospital, Dr. Nicholas Langer. And those interviews have never been seen anywhere else. So we're going to clear up a lot of stuff in this book. It's time to get get us back to reality and get us back to a true picture of Bela. And even in tragedy, the story is incredibly inspiring. You can only admire this man for his remaining true to his principles, even when it cost him his country, his first wife, his family, whatever it was. This man knew no compromise.
Mm-hmm.
And perfectionism was, as we detail in the book, his crowning achievement and probably his greatest failing, because he didn't know when to stop.
Mm-hmm.
And the studios took advantage of him because they knew he was a perfectionist. And even in low budget movies where he was not paid adequately for his talent, he would give them 1,000%. And that, of course, had deleterious effects on him, particularly as he aged.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very moving story, and one I find inspiring. And I've talked, oddly enough, to a number of fans about this, and all of them have mentioned that they found something inspiring in the original book
Mm-hmm.
that they read that
Yeah.
gave them hope for the future when they were facing similar issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hoping that that number will increase with the publication of the new book.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I strongly do believe that that's one of the reasons why that Bela's legacy like has lived on. And I mean outside of his iconic role like as the Count, but just who he was as a person. Knowing that he. I mean, like he really wanted the role like of Dracula, but Universal kept telling him no, and then but he persisted on. He just wouldn't take no as an answer. And and it really goes to show that that when you don't take no as an answer, that there can be incredible rewards. And just knowing just how different things would have been, just what would have happened, like say that if he would have given up. And reminds me of a saying that I once heard, that you only fail only when you stop putting in the effort.
Yep.
That's very true.
Yeah.
And yeah, and especially knowing that I've even heard people who have said that, I'm at the age now where I can't go do what I want, and so therefore I can't go do it. And so I often will use both Boris and even Bela like as examples, like where Boris Karloff, he was in his 40s, like when he did the original, like when Frankenstein, like when he was doing that movie. And Bela Lugosi, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe he was 49 or around that age.
When he was in the 1931 film?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so yeah, and it really goes to show that age is not an excuse, and ultimately the only time when it is too late is when you have passed on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He
Yeah,
was very
Sidney
tenacious.
Greenstreet got his first role when he was in his 60s. So you're never too old to start.
Exactly. Exactly. And yeah, and also like just knowing everything else about Bela, with like, like with how he's inspired other people. And it's really incredible, knowing everything that he did within his life and just, and, and yeah. And one of the things that I say, I know the meaning of life is a very big topic, but I by no means claim to have it all figured out. But what I will confidently say is a part of that equation is, what do you leave behind after you pass on, and and that is all defined by what we do in this moment.
Yeah.
And yeah, and just with the life that Bela left behind, he definitely left behind an incredible legacy, and it definitely will be great, like for all these readers, who would like to just get a better taste of what his life truly was like when this book comes out.
Yeah. Appreciate
That's our hope.
that. Yeah.
So, would either of you have an approximation for when this book will be released?
Well, at this point, I think that we have to really give a lot of thanks and appreciation to Clover Press for their patience and letting Bob and I do this book the way we want it done. And even though there's been some delays, they've stuck with us and are supporting us. So, we really, really hope that this book is out this year, and we expect it to be, but I can't unfortunately give you an exact date right now.
Yeah.
We're
Okay.
hoping it's going to be a nice Christmas present for a lot of people.
Yes.
Oh yeah, certainly so. And yeah, and if it is a Christmas present, I could definitely be sure to add it onto my Christmas list. And if not for Christmas, uh, my birthday actually is at around Christmas time, and so say I could either have it be a birthday present, or I even could have it be a Christmas gift. So,
Well, I hope so.
so yeah, awesome. But yeah, so if anybody were to purchase this book, I imagine that they could probably buy it off of the website, like for Bela Lugosi, or I imagine maybe off of Amazon.
You can pre-order it at Clover Press, the publisher, and on Amazon.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Yeah. At this point, we don't sell anything from our website, but you can definitely go to cloverpress.com or Amazon.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, that's all definitely really good to hear. But yeah, that about does her. But yeah, before we wrap things up, are there any last final words that either of you would want to say?
I just thank you for the nice interview and your interest in uh, introducing us and the book to your listeners.
Yeah, anytime.
Yes. And I second the motion.
Awesome. But yeah, thank you both so much. And I will be sure to let you know when. I'll be sure to let you know when this is up. And yeah, we will keep in touch.
Okay, thank you, Eric.
We'll do that. Thank you very much, Eric.
Yeah, of course. And thank you both for taking time out of your day to be here.
It's a
Our
pleasure.
Of course, it means a lot.